Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 9 of Featherweight Flyers, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of lightweight, generally road cars, but cars which are inclined towards being track machines, kind of like mini, more affordable race cars. And in this particular pick, we're discussing a vehicle which is one of the lesser used models, probably one of the first vehicles that would come to mind when you think of this category overall, but still not necessarily a highly used vehicle within the category. And the car is the Lotus Elise Sport 190. Now, we're not going to be reviewing all of the Lotus Elises that are on the game, because it's just not necessary. This is the ultimate Elise that you can get on Gran Turismo. The race cars cost more and do have a higher PP, but they're not faster. The handling is better. Overall, though, both of those race cars can't even beat really any of the cars in this series. They have very good handling, but they just don't have the straight line performance. The Elise Sport 190, on the other hand, is the ultimate road-going variant of the Elise, which we currently have on the game, because of course the Elise GT1 is no longer on Gran Turismo, which is a shame. But be that as it may, what do you get from the Elise Sport 190? Well, you get a 1.8 litre naturally aspirated engine, and the spec in some ways is better than you might expect, in some ways not quite as good, especially when you compare it to the closest thing to this car in the series, which has been the Motorsport Elise, which is more expensive. That's a 100 grand car compared to 65 grand for this vehicle, but also has more power. This, though, is a lighter car, so it's interesting to see how each one one-ups the other in different ways. This car is very lightweight at just 594 kilos, which is very impressive. That is lighter than the Motorsport Elise, for instance, but it's also not as powerful. The Motorsport Elise has over 350 horsepower. This car makes do with 305. So it's not bad by any means, but it's not as powerful as you might hope. In fact, it has less power than most of the other cars in this series. It puts out 202 foot-pounds of torque, and the PP is, I would say, unfortunately a little bit too high. 582 PP is very high for this car. That's a lot higher than many of the other cars in this series that actually have more power. They may not necessarily be quite as light, but they're not too far off it. So, is it competitive enough? Because the price is better than some, but worse than others. The PP would indicate that it's an amazing car, but the power doesn't really back up that kind of PP claim. It also only puts out 513 horsepower per tonne, which, although that isn't bad by any means, it's not necessarily as high as you might hope for from a car that is so light. So what's the story on the 190? Is it any good? Well, it's a non-premium car, which is kind of a shame. There is, of course, a premium Elise of the same generation, but it's not as powerful. And this is marketed as the hardcore Elise. Now, there were eventually more powerful models, especially when it turned into the Exige, but this version is the ultimate version of the hardcore Elise that we have on the game. In terms of straight line performance, it's okay. It's not amazing, but with 305 horsepower, you're probably not too surprised to hear me say that. As far as acceleration, it's pretty good. It can match, say, the Motorsport Elise or the VX220 for the most part. So the real important thing for this car, or for any car in this series really, is the handling. How does it perform around corners and around the track as a whole? Well, kind of good and bad. It's not, strictly speaking, bad in the absolute sense, but not quite as good as you might hope. The handling, I would say, is better on this car than the Motorsport Elise, or at least the steering is. It's not necessarily easier to drive, but it does feel sharper, more nimble, more focused, and certainly more hardcore, which is kind of ironic given that the Motorsport Elise is, as the name suggests, a motorsport geared version. Overall, It's not a bad car, certainly not, but I very rarely, if ever, use this car on Gran Turismo anymore, and to be honest, that's not just because of this car, but I don't really use any of the Elises. Not because they're bad vehicles, but because there are just better options. The other vehicles such as the VX220, the Garaya, the ZZS, simply offer more for a better price. Sometimes around the same price, often less. The VX220 is significantly cheaper and faster in a straight line. The Tomicara ZZ2 is completely unmatched in terms of top speed compared to this car. It's over 25 miles per hour faster. And other vehicles such as the Rocket and the KTM Crossbow aren't really in the same league anyway, although they are technically the same kind of vehicle. Very lightweight, track-going sports cars. So I would say that overall the Elise 190 feels a little bit niched compared to the cars which are now available as actually good alternatives. Because back on, say, Gran Turismo 4, for instance, the Sport 190 was much more of a pack leader than it is now, because back then we didn't have stuff like the light car company Rocket, we didn't have the KTM Crossbow, so it was much more of a niched category than it is now. It still is a niche, but it was even more so back then, and the 190 naturally was one of the leaders of it. Now that's just not the case anymore. It doesn't lead the pack in the same way that it used to. It's certainly not a bad car in any particular way, but it's not beginner friendly. It requires careful tuning to keep the car in line, and even then it is a very twitchy machine. And there are quite simply, in my opinion at least, just better options than this car. So unless you're specifically a fan of the Sport 190, I wouldn't really recommend it over other cars in this series. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.